What's up, everybody? This is Adam from AdMine Analytics, and you're listening to the AdMine Analytics podcast. More people than ever are trying to tie all their marketing data together in a way that helps them actually move the needle for performance. Why do I say actually? Well, because more often than not, tech tools are overpromised, marketing teams are understaffed, and the data just keeps pouring in, which all lead to marketing analytics data that's just not quite helpful enough. On this show, our founder and I discuss all things marketing analytics to help you navigate those complicated waters so you can measure the impact of your marketing and use that data to push your business to the next level. Okay, welcome back to another episode of the AdMine Analytics podcast. This is episode 2. This is the second half of our insights conversation that we started last time. Last time we talked about what an insight is, that there's tons of different definitions of it out there. And what we define an insight is as something that you didn't know that you can act on to improve performance. And in that context, there's two categories of things you didn't know that you can use to improve performance. There's owned data and there's third-party data. In our previous conversation, we talked about owned data, which are things like changes in your data quality or your data performance, how you can slice the data, comparing different segments, how you can do attribution modeling or contribution analysis, and then customer surveys. Today, we're going to talk about the data that comes from third-party sources. So if you haven't checked out that first episode, go back and give that a listen. They're not necessarily contingent one on the other, but it helps to round out the whole picture. All right, before we get too far into that, Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Adam.
Excellent.
Glad to be podcasting. It's a Friday for us, and I love a Friday.
Good to be feeling good. All right. So in the owned data category, there's three things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about comparing your data against benchmarks, combining your data with other data from other sources, benchmarking things, enrichment, things like that. And then just general market research. Do you any additional context for those three things, or kind of why you feel like those are the third-party things that make the most sense for finding insights?
One of the things that you'll notice as we go through is some of them have a parallel to the first-party ones. So when we talk about enriching the data, that's kind of the same thing as slicing the data to find comparisons, but just powered by third-party data sources that you don't own. So it's kind of the same thing. Market research has a parallel to customer surveys. Customer surveys are talking to people that you do know as an organization. Market research is about conducting surveys or gathering data from people that are not yet your customers. So you'll see that there's some comparisons there. Some of them have parallels.
Okay, good to know. All right, let's talk about comparing your data against benchmarks. And this is a super interesting one from a marketing seat, because you're always wondering how you're performing, not only against your historical self, but against competitors specifically in your space. And the things that you're most interested in typically, and I'll just kind of rattle off a few, and if you've got others that you feel like are the ones that come top of mind to me, are things like all the way from like traffic generation. So like obviously your rankings, if you're doing SEO kind of stuff, your PPC costs, your volume of PPC, the amount of channels that you have, how well you're doing on those channels compared to your competitors. And then from there, it's things like click-through rate and cost per acquisition, and the acquisition cost is largely dependent on the conversion rate. That's another thing that I'm always curious about is, how are our landing pages or our funnels or our website, how are we performing against competitors, and what does their stuff look like? What other things fall into that category for you that are interesting to benchmark against a broader audience that's not just your data?
Well, so I'm actually kind of curious about I have a few things that come to mind that are interesting to me, but I'm interested because you sat in the director of marketing seat more often than I have, the person who's responsible for thinking about tactics and strategy and stuff. So I'm kind of interested to know, like, are there things that like keep you up at night where you go like, I don't know how I benchmark against other people, but it scares me that my competitors are probably doing better than me at X, Y, or Z. Are there things like that?
Yeah, for sure. I'll tell you, I'll kind of work backwards in my mind from where I am now through some previous ones. And cost per acquisition, I think, is the biggest one because you use that as an operating mechanism for budget justifications. And we know as marketers, there's a lot that goes into that cost for per acquisition, and then there's obviously different definitions of that. And what I'm talking about is like a qualified lead in a lead gen sense, or a sale of your like around your average order volume, like your target sort of sales volume, where I'm looking at that going like, are my competitors, where am I relative to my competitors? Am I outperforming them? Am I underperforming them? There's oftentimes I go, they couldn't possibly be spending much more than I am to acquire these leads based on what my known factors are. But there's always that like, is there some secret sauce that I don't have access to that my competitors do? So, but anyway, to answer your question, like the things along the lines of stuff that keeps me up are things like cost per click data and how I'm doing in my click through rates, my conversion rates, and then the conversion rates on a given flow through the website, whether that's like a
Yeah.
landing page to something like that, or if they're just generally converting on the website. What does that cost per conversion look like?
One of the things that I'm always interested in, I read something in a book recently that talked about um, what the top 0.1% of advertisers in Facebook do compared to what the average does, like what the biggest differences are between the top 0.1%. And it always makes me think about, like in my mind, I draw the picture of the bell curve and I go, I know there's people on that super high end that are getting extraordinary results, that have extraordinary low costs and have incredible conversion rates. And I just go, where am I? Like, am I on the top end of that? Or like,
Yeah,
am I in the middle of that? And if I'm in the middle of it, then what is going on at the top end of that? Like,
right.
what's the high end of what people could expect? So I'm
Yeah,
always interested in that. Um, and, and with experience running conversion testing and reading about that for, a lot of my career, you always read about the circumstances, and every person who's been involved in testing has a few of them where you go, we moved the needle on a conversion rate by 400% with whatever we did.
yeah,
We changed something 4x. You go, that's got to be happening other places. And so if I think that I have a pretty good conversion rate at some stage in my funnel, I know that there's somebody who's testing a stage like that, who's probably had a win, that's probably like a 4x different change. So like, I'm always thinking about, just for this given, and it's, to me, I'm always thinking about rates. Like, what was my click
yeah,
through rate, or what was my landing page to offer page rate? What was my rate of acceptance of the offer? Those sort of things are, I'm always curious about that.
yeah,
And it's disorienting. And so the things that I think about are usually rate based. And then sometimes I think about distribution of activity stuff. So things like, I know that in my e-commerce store that I've got 70 or 75% mobile traffic. And 5 or 6 years ago, that was not like the distribution didn't look like that at all. And
totally.
so I'm also kind of curious too, thinking about my competitors and things. And I'm thinking, when we do B2B work or something, I'm always going like, we have quite a lot of desktop in this sort of scenario. I wonder if some of our competitors have figured out how to create content and get engagement that is much more useful on mobile. And there's some B2B offering out there that just has like an even desktop to mobile split, and they
Mhm.
just love it. They're just stoked about
Yeah,
their mobile traffic. And so sometimes I'm thinking about ratios like that. Device ratios make me think about that. I also think about budgets. Like, if I'm spending, 60% of my budget on paid search, what are my competitors doing? Are they spending 60% there? Are they spending 0% there? And they've got another lead magnet and lead funnel. So I'm interested in distributions of spend, distributions of conversions, distributions of traffic, and
yeah.
conversion rates. That's what I'm thinking about.
So where now, like we can hypothesize all day long about like what our competitors may or may not be doing, um, but it's not as though we're going to get that information specifically. So when we're talking about an insight and something that we didn't know that we can use to act on to improve performance, but we're talking about third-party data. In this context of comparing like these benchmarking things, where are some of the places that people would be able to get this
Gather this.
information?
Yeah. So the answer is that there's not just a place that you go to buy this stuff or to get it necessarily. What's interesting is to know that this is a color that you paint with, and so you can kind of identify it and as an insight, color on your color palette, and then you can kind of be aware of it when you have those opportunities and try to be intentional about capturing them. So here's where I've seen them. A lot of times there's like really tool specific sort of things, like Google Ads will tell you what your impression share is. So you can get specific information there. In Google Search Console, you can get a sense for what the number of searches you rank for are and what your average position is compared to other average positions in search rankings. So a lot of times there's like specific information. There's actually a pretty decent information. HubSpot keeps a great blog for these sort of things. They talk about sometimes general stuff like landing page best practices, but they also talk about typical types of conversion rates, what you can expect in conversion rates between device types, between offers. There's a lot of this stuff comes from content creators where you can get some insight into what other benchmarks are. So HubSpot's got a great blog, but lots of times you can search some of this stuff.
Yeah.
The other places you find this are you make a new hire and you bring somebody into your organization that's just come from another organization. They usually have a working knowledge of what some of their performance measures were. Another sort of scenario where you get this is when you go to trainings or to conferences. Sometimes even you can find it in webinars, but where you're gathering other people's individual experiences or where they're sharing them at large, and you can sort of get a picture of what their average performance metrics were.
Yeah.
So that's where I've seen them. I've seen them in platforms, in content creation, in blogs, from new hires, and at conference sort of things. That's about where I've seen them.
I'm gonna push into one of those a little bit and give some of my thoughts. But before I do that, I'm gonna throw to you a question, which is, as an analytics expert and having done this for a long time, let's give people some of the benchmarks that we see that we think would be relevant sort of across the board within the analytics data.
Okay,
So,
off the cuff. Off the cuff.
Yeah.
Here's a few that come to mind.
Okay.
So one of them is a ratio of visitors that you are not tracking in your analytics system. So whether that's by cookie policy consent sort of things that people are opting out of tracking, or whether that's by plugins in the browser that prevent tracking from loading, everybody is always interested in knowing, like, how much of the data are we actually not seeing? So US and Canada 2023 data, usually in across industries, like just an industry average, is something like 6 or 7% of the data that you don't collect based on visitors that are blocking tracking for one reason or another. That's US and Canada. Now, sometimes it's industry specific. If you get more into an IT sort of an industry, we've seen scenarios where it's 15 to 20% of traffic because you have just a more security conscious audience that are opting out of tracking or opting out of cookie or opting out from a cookie policy perspective. When you get into the EU and Europe, in Germany is the worst one. That a lot of times in just like in a direct to consumer offering, so just kind of an average person's disposition, you might be 30 or 40% of your data where people are actively opting in opting out, which is the default there. So maybe 50 or 60% of them are opting into data collection. So you're missing more than a third of the traffic in those scenarios. So that's one.
Okay.
How much traffic gets collected. Another one that when you were talking about what things have I looked at over time, one that shocked me the first time I learned it, like 12 or 13 years ago, looking at an analytics platform and looking at somebody's e-commerce data in one of my first consulting gigs and thinking like, man, these guys have got to be stinking, is the starting checkout to purchase rate, average rate. And that's usually like a third. So usually a third of people who add something to cart are checking out and actually purchasing that thing. And I thought like, what? That's got to be insane, but that's pretty
what it
high.
is.
That's pretty average. Another one is a ratio of direct traffic, because when you're looking at web analytics, direct traffic is the catch-all bucket that catches anything that doesn't have attribution information in it. So if you have problems where you're not tagging the traffic appropriately, or you have a redirect on your site or something that's stripping attribution information, then it falls into direct. So a lot of times people are looking at direct going, if it's high, does it mean that we have some tracking or attribution problem someplace? So most advertisers have direct traffic between 10 and 15% of their overall traffic to marketing material. If you're including like a product or a login system, if you're E-Trade and people are logging into a stock platform, and that's part of your analytics data set, then obviously that skews that number way higher, because you've got tons and tons of returning users that are coming directly back to you frequently. But usually that's a 10, 15, sometimes 20% number. On occasion, if you see somebody who's really heavy in offline data collect, or like offline marketing efforts, lots of TV and radio, then you might see things that are 30 or 35%, but usually it's not above that if there's not an error. Let's see any others that come to mind. Most like ratios of browser usage, and this has shifted in recent years, like Safari and Google Chrome are usually represent like 40% of the traffic each across. And thinking about desktop and mobile, kind of combining those two, they represent maybe 40% of the traffic each, and so 20% is others. So if you have something like lots of IE, or if that ratio is, if you're not 40, you're kind of evenly weighted between Chrome and Safari, then that's probably abnormal. Let's see.
It's a good list.
One more is like detail page to add to cart rate. If you're in e-commerce, that's usually it ranges depending on your offering. So there's a little bit broader of a range here, but this is usually like low end 7 or 8%, high end 20%. It's usually not much more than that. It's in those ranges, usually higher on desktop than mobile. Oh, that's another one, mobile to desktop conversion rate ratios. So usually on desktop, you have, if your average e-commerce conversion rate, the number of people who purchase over the number of people who visit, that typical number is around 3% on average for a pretty well-performing e-commerce offering. And typically when you slice that and break it down by desktop and mobile, you usually have something like a 1 and 1.5 or something percentage on mobile, and something like a 4 or 4.5 or 5 on desktop. So that the ratio between your mobile conversion rate and your desktop conversion rate is usually 3x. Your desktop conversion rate is usually 3 times better.
Wow.
I know those are some that come to mind.
Yeah, those are good ones. I think it helps kind of orient people in the space that they're in. The only other thing
I got one for you. Sorry, interrupting you. I got one for you. What do you think from a B2B sort of, or like a lead gen offering perspective? What do you think for targeted traffic? So use that generally. The rate is from visit to lead submission. What do you think that the typical benchmark is there?
I think that it's going to be somewhere between 15 and 20%.
If you're performing pretty well.
Yeah, because you said the word targeted, like targeted traffic. So I'm going to say things like, your little mid funnel kind of stuff. These people are aware. They might not be searching for your brand, but they're maybe searching specifically for the problem that you solve.
Yep.
I'd say you're going to be in that. Anything less than 15%, and
means you're probably not targeted right.
Yeah. Putting some energy into bringing that up. Anything more than 20%, and there's probably other areas of your
you probably buy more traffic
process that you could improve on.
Oh, sure.
To drive the numbers up. But
sure.
What I was going to say is a great resource for finding some of these benchmark things is I'm just pointing out, when we want to know about like analytics benchmark stuff, and then I'm asking you as an analytics engineer what those things are. By that same token, you mentioned HubSpot. There's Shopify is big in the e-com space. There's also going to be big, there's big multifaceted, multi-serviced agencies who produce a lot of content because they're trying to elevate their brand. And as part of that, they'll typically like anonymize their own client base and then produce some pretty compelling benchmarking stuff. So in terms of like, if you're over here going like, well, yeah, I'd love to know how I'm competing, how am I doing in my e-commerce against other general e-commerce? There are some places you can go to get some decent insights into how those things are performing. It's not like you're just kind of blindly wondering what those things are. So
Yeah.
hopefully with that, you can kind of get some interesting waypoints, checkpoints for yourself. So, okay, let's move on to the next one, combining other data with your data. So this is what we typically refer to as data enrichment. There's going to be like, when I hear data enrichment, I have sales call vibes of people calling and saying like, oh, Adam, wouldn't you love to know all the companies of the people that are visiting your website? We can plug that into your system automatically, and their phone numbers and their kids' names and their soccer team. It's like, I don't know how anybody's doing any of that stuff. And I understand the value of being able to be targeted in time with the people that I'm talking to, but that's what I think of when I think of enrichment. But there's also other kind of areas that falls into. So Mike, give us a little orientation around like, what do you mean by enrichment as a third party way of getting insights?
So there's usually like the way that I categorize this is how you enrich the data. So one way to enrich the data, like the mechanism of joining your data with somebody else's data set. And that's what I'll say. Like, how do you join somebody else's information with your information? And that's a good way to categorize. So one way is, if you have personally identifiable information, if you have an email address, and you could argue the legality or the ethics of this.
Yeah. We'll save that for another podcast.
Yeah, for another podcast. But the idea is that there's data sharing sort of aggregators where you can say, tell me, what do you know about this person? Do they subscribe to, do they have a Facebook account? And if they have a Facebook account, can we get some idea of what their interests are? Like, you can, if you have personally identifiable information, you can join that with data aggregators to build some more of an interest-based profile. So that's like, think about addresses, names, locations of living, email addresses. Those are the sort of ways that you can enrich the data. And that's that's almost more of a sales flavor of marketing than it is a marketing flavor of marketing enrichment, because you're usually dealing with known people.
Yeah.
Another way.
Oh, yeah,
go ahead.
No.
The second, so that's like one way of joining is based on personal information. The other way of joining to anonymous data is either based on IP address, and IP address is usually used for the purpose of approximating geography. So, or like company ownership. So one of the things you pointed out, and there's, billion-dollar businesses in this space that will you can install their tracking on your site, and it will look at the IP address of your visitors, and it will assess what company they likely belong to. And if you're a B2B offering, then you can use this in account-based marketing, where you can say, we've had a spike of visitors from Microsoft lately. Let's get our Microsoft sales rep making some phone calls and seeing what those guys are interested in. And one of the groups that executes this stuff really well is HubSpot. Actually, HubSpot does their sales outbound teams do a great job of knowing when you're visiting their site, either by known information or by your business information, and then reaching out to your business. They're extraordinary at it. But in addition to that, you can get things you can do, because you can take an IP address and you can also get an approximate geography. You can do things like take that zip code and the surrounding zip codes and join that with census data. So you can say, if this is a D2C offering, I can say, what is the likely income level of the people that are visiting my site, and as a result of their likely geographies. So I mentioned at the top of the discussion that this is useful when you pair it with the slice and comparison insight generating method that we talked about the last podcast. Because if you enrich your data with that stuff, it's only useful. You only find things that you didn't know if you start comparing slices against one another. Let's look at income bracket level 1 versus income bracket level 2. Oh my gosh, our conversion rate's twice as high there. Okay, that means maybe we ought to target our advertising. So you gain those insights after you enrich the data, you slice and compare, and then find areas where you could maybe improve targeting or messaging, etc.
Yeah. And you'd have to have a decent amount of data for that to be useful to you. in terms of combining the data with your data and then being able to act on it, like getting those insights all the way back into your marketing decision making
Can I
is
can I tell you a dumb story?
yeah, absolutely.
Once upon a time, a number of years ago, when I was way less smart, which is not that much different than today, but we decided we had this great idea. We thought we can build something where we'll grab the IP addresses, we'll find out what the approximate geographic location is, we'll find out what the real-time weather conditions are at that geographic location, and then we'll enrich the data that we collect about our web visitors with whether it was sunny or cloudy or whether it was high pressure or low pressure and what the temperature was.
Nice.
And we thought, like, that's a great idea, because then what you can do is you can then do real-time bidding targeting based on weather. So if you find out, hey, we're a golf course and when it gets cloudy, like our tee times don't fill up, so we should run a special, turn up the advertising on our specials campaign or something.
Yeah.
We thought that's a great idea. It enriched the data. It worked. And we actually found some interesting things. We found we were working with a chronic pain advertiser at that point in time. And we found that they actually did get better conversion rates when barometric pressure was higher. That related to chronic pain. So interesting.
Yeah.
But what we found in addition to that was that there were so many fundamental things that people were failing with in their just basic targeting and their basic conversion tracking and their basic messaging and testing and their basic functionality, that like adding this extra fancy layer of weather-based targeting on top of that.
That wasn't the silver bullet that they needed.
Didn't move any needles at all. And so some of this stuff is interesting because we've talked about this maybe a little in the last podcast. These are all areas where you can gather insights. Not each one of them has the same amount of return on investment for a given advertiser. And this is one of the areas that's expensive because you're buying somebody else's data. Then you're hoping you can slice it to find something that's actually different. So maybe you don't even find anything that's different across however you've enriched the data. And then hopefully you can target or message according to it to take advantage of a difference. So there's kind of like three things that have to work out in order for this to be a profitable investment.
Yeah. All right. Okay, let's move on to the last one, which is market research. So what we're talking about here with market research is that you have invested dollars in having a third-party company sort of slice and dice the population and pull out like what they think is a mix of your likely audience. And then they are putting that audience to the test. And whether that test is like a user interface kind of thing, or whether it's actual like product tasting. This is what we're talking about when we, even like movies will do this, right? When they sample audiences and they'll have a third party company that goes and brings people in to show them a movie, and that character didn't test very well, or whatever the case may be. Now in my career, I've never once engaged a market research company for information.
Ooh, that's not true. We've done it together.
Well, we've done it.
Okay.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Yeah,
like we've been the market researchers.
No. We've engaged somebody before. We had them create surveys. They send out population. Do you remember we did this where we were trying to investigate the likelihood for a new product, and we sent out information surveys and stuff on LinkedIn to people we had no idea who they were, and paid for them to fill out some survey thing, got responses back, and found out that 99 out of 100 responses were absolute garbage. Dog junk.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. That didn't come to mind to me because
it wasn't that useful.
The kind of answers that we got, like it was such an abject failure that it was more a learning lesson for us on how to do that stuff than the value that we got out of it. But my point, what I was getting towards was, I'm married. My wife is works at a large agency that handles big clients in retail and insurance, and she's a VP of client services. And so she's often strategizing with the client to kind of think about those things. And I didn't realize, like, it's not, I think I've had this notion that with market research, there's just, you pay somebody who like goes into the store and sort of watches people, and then as they're leaving goes up and says like, oh, hey, you chose this product, not that product. Can I talk to you or whatever? And that might be the guerrilla marketing way of doing that before you get like arrested by the police for harassment. The professional means by which that happens is you actually like have a shopping force that gets recruited, and they are paid to then go into the store and then come back out and report. And then all of the data is sort of, you can't, there's no, for privacy's sake, you can't get, there's limited information you can even get about those people back to the client who paid for that research. So have you had separate experiences with this or separate thoughts, or kind of, again, that's my only experience. No. It's not to say like, I don't want anybody in the customer research game coming after us. I'm sure there's a lot of value when it's done correctly. It's just in the digital marketing world, there's not a lot of overlap between those sorts of in-person sort of things and what you're doing online. Now, if you're like Home Depot or Target or something like that, and you drive a massive e-commerce platform and you want to know how that's relating to it, then obviously it makes more sense. But what's your experience been with that kind of market research?
It's literally that I've spent all of my career in the mid-market. And so I've seen never have I seen success doing this from third-party validation sort of efforts in the mid-market. I am aware of scenarios where there's been learning in the enterprise, but I've never seen one. So I know it's an area of insight, and it's largely outside of budget reach. If somebody has an idea for the way mid-market people have done this profitably and learned reliably, I would love to know.
One of the things that we've talked about in that vein is like coming up with tracking and tagging in a campaign for people who didn't convert on the website, and then hunting them down online through retargeting to try and get them to fill out a survey to tell us why they didn't buy something. All the surveys now are like, oh, customer service and how do we do? And it's like, if we could figure out how to productize that idea that you're going to follow people around and give that sort of,
that's $1 billion. That's a unicorn, right? That's a uni.
We'll do
uni right there.
We'll delete that audio file from the podcast. But there's some interesting stuff to be gained there. But to your point, in our space, there's not a ton of value there. There are other, we get pitched every once in a while from people that like, what's the name of the institute? It starts with a G, Gartner.
Yeah,
what
Gartner.
Is it? Gartner. And there's sort of mixed reviews about that and the experience that you can have there, because wouldn't you know it that like by the time you've paid for that data, you're also being advertised to the people who were recommended as the best in those quadrants and all that kind of stuff. And it seems a little like the fox guarding the hen house a little bit, but
get you coming and going.
There are some of those things that can be in specific applications could be helpful for some benchmarking. Yep. So, all right, Mike, any other thoughts on third-party data and getting things that you didn't know that you can act on to improve performance?
No, other than just if you think of a category that we haven't covered here, these are kind of, I think you used the example in our last discussion that these are like colors. You might listen to these and go, you describe purple and I kind of hear violet here. Okay. All right. We're painting with broad strokes, but if you think that you've heard red, green, and yellow, and there's absolutely a blue that we haven't talked about, then tell us. I would love to know a bucket that I haven't thought about.
Yeah, absolutely. Let us know. We'd love to hear it. Thanks for listening. All right, that's it. 34 minutes.